Well, I think it'd be very rare to not have a year with any regulatory challenges, but certainly in 2020 there's a number of prominent issues and challenges. We're just off the back of a full rollout of the senior managers and certification regime. That is another market-wide piece of regulation that we've all had to grapple with. I think certainly it's not a complex piece of legislation, but it's going to introduce a few logistical issues for a number of firms, and we know it obviously can't be treated as a tick box exercise. So that issue is going to rumble on. Our old friend MiFID II, that was implemented over 2 years ago. That's still causing a number of issues for advisor firms. We're actually expecting an amendment to MiFID II to be announced at some point in 2020, and that's going to bring ESG investing into the mainstream and into the heart of the advisory process. So that's definitely something to look out for. We obviously know that a lot of advisor firms are still working through the practicalities and implications of implementing a compliant prod process. And on top of all that, we know the regulator is about to commence a review into the effectiveness of both the retail distribution review and the financial advice market review. So I think all of that, when you put it into the mixer, creates quite an uncertain regulatory landscape as we move into 2020. Well, one of the more pertinent issues from MiFID II is the whole cost and charges disclosure piece. And by talking about issues, I'm not talking about just populating that data, because a lot of that is commonplace now. I think if we're all honest with ourselves, this does have a bit of a feel of a tick box exercise at the moment across the industry. I've no doubt that in the next 18 to 24 months, I think collectively we'll be in a much stronger place across the industry in that area. But right now, number of issues in that particular area. And that has largely been contributed to by a lack of good quality data being fed down through the distribution chain from manufacturers. So particularly around the categorization of the different cost categories we need to pull out. So that's a big issue. We know there still remains a lot of regulatory scrutiny in that particular area. So we know the regulator is actively looking at how firms are disclosing both their ex-ante costs and charges and ex-post costs and charges. So there are a number of issues. And also the 10% drop reporting rule for in-scope investments managed on a discretionary basis. Since MiFID II was implemented over 2 years ago, we've actually had one instance of the market falling by 10% or more over a quarterly period, so Q4 2018. And that introduced a number of implications, predominantly around roles and responsibilities for communicating that 10% fall to end clients. And even monitoring a 10% fall is much harder than it sounds, particularly where there are multiple parties in the distribution chain, and particularly where client assets are split over multiple platforms. One of the key requirements for advisors under PROD is this requirement to identify target markets within the client bank, because that presumably means that advisors are going to have to review their client bank, segment their client bank, and in some cases sub-segment the client bank. Now, the good thing about PROD is that there is not one hard rule in there which explicitly tells advisors how they should be going about doing that exercise. It basically needs to be about the advisor's client bank and the wants, needs, and characteristics of their particular clients. And I think there's several ways that advisors can slice their client bank up in a post-PROD environment. So I'm talking about things like financial life stages, current income requirements, or maybe even something as simple as capacity for loss or a client's investment experience or expertise. There's certainly no point overcomplicating this. Essentially what PROD is, it's an exercise to identify the different client needs across the client bank and in turn identify different segments. And I think once you've identified those needs and segments, that is effectively the first half of PROD over and done with. The second part is mapping solutions to those segments. So effectively taking the output from your target market analysis and feeding that into your wider research, your wider due diligence, and the client's overall suitability framework. And I think if advisors have a process that does that, it's documented, and advisors review that on a regular basis, I think that is a really effective way of implementing a robust and compliant PROD process. Well, I think there's a lot of regulatory changes afoot to do with ESG investing coming in 2020 that are going to have a fundamental impact on the advisory process. Since 2018, there's actually been over 170 ESG-related regulatory measures proposed globally. So I think that gives you an indication of the scale of change coming in this particular area. If we think closer to home in the UK, we know we had new regulations introduced by the DWP in October of last year. So they were aimed at trustees of occupational pension schemes. They centred around updating statement of investment principles to show how ESG factors are taken into account within the investment decision-making process. But the biggest impact for advisors is this proposed amendment to MiFID II, made by the European Securities and Markets Authority. And I must stress, this is an amendment to MiFID II, so it's not a brand new EU directive. But the changes here strike right at the heart of the suitability process, or assessing suitability process. The changes will require firms to take their clients' ESG preferences into account when assessing their investment objectives, and advisor firms will also need to take ESG characteristics into account in respect of existing organisational requirements. And by existing organisational requirements, I'm talking about things like systems, controls, processes, conflicts of interest policies, that sort of thing. Now, we're expecting ESMA to publish the final rules on this at some point in the first half of 2020, so we'll have much more detail and clarity on the exact requirements and the timescales involved at that point. But that is definitely something for advisors to look out for, and potentially something to start preparing for in their client conversations now.